What's up, everybody? Dr. Rossi, board certified psychiatrist, bringing you another exciting psychiatric video and a topic that I think you guys are going to be really excited about. Now, before I get into the topic, I want to ask you guys that are new to the channel or new members to the community, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help me to keep this thing going. And also, if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for all of the love and support. It does mean a lot to me, and we are doing well with it. So, today's topic is a good one, and you might be saying, why is this even in, what is this topic? What does he care about? Well, there's one big problem in psychiatry that I think other medical specialties don't have to face, and that is the possibility that somebody who comes in to see you is faking symptoms for the purpose of secondary gain. Now, when I say that, what does that mean? Faking symptoms for the purpose of secondary gain, in the industry, we would call that malingering. Now, a majority of patients who come to see us are not faking symptoms for some type of secondary gain, but we should be aware of situations where this could occur and what we could potentially do about it to help identify these circumstances or situations. So the topic of today's video is going to be malingering in psychiatric practice, and I'm going to be talking about what it is and what we can potentially do about it to recognize it and identify it when it is occurring. So I hope you enjoy the topic. All right, so let's start out with the definition of malingering because we need to know what we're talking about here. So malingering is the production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms for the purpose of secondary gain that's motivated by external factors. Now, of course, a good next question or follow-up question is going to be, what are those external factors? Well, there are several. One, of course, is going to be avoiding work. One reason why I might fake symptoms is to avoid going to my job. Another one might be to avoid military service. For example, somebody that joins the military, gets to basic training, and decides that this isn't for me, it's way too hard and way too nuts, I need to get out. That would be another case where you might feign symptoms. Financial incentives is another one. Legal action, avoidance of legal action, like avoidance of jail. For example, if I'm arrested for something and I'm going to jail, I might say, whoa, before I go, I'm suicidal, I'm going to kill myself, right? That's a common reason that somebody might be malingering. And another one is the ability to obtain controlled substances. Somebody might be faking ADHD symptoms to obtain amphetamine-based medications. Somebody might be feigning anxiety symptoms to obtain benzodiazepine medications, for example, just to name a few. Now, it's important to keep in mind that faking mental illness is not the same as malingering because we can't assume what the motivation or the motivational factor is. And this does matter because there's a difference between malingering when you're motivated by external factors and factitious disorder when you're motivated to assume the role of the patient or assume the sick role. So there are differences there. Now, in the ER, approximately 20% of all encounters involve malingering, and in disability cases, the rates are even higher. Up to 25 to 30% of disability cases involve some form of malingering. When we're starting to suspect somebody is malingering, there's 4 factors that I want to kind of just in general offer you to start thinking about when you're seeing somebody or thinking about this as a possibility. So when somebody presents with rare symptoms that are not commonly seen in psychiatric practice, this is going to be something that might alert you to this possibility. When there's improbable symptoms that are reported, things that don't make any sense. And also when symptoms are reported in rare combinations, and combinations are clusters that don't usually go together. If you look at the DSM-5 manual, for example, you'll see that the depressive symptoms kind of all cluster together, the manic symptoms all cluster together, psychotic symptoms all cluster together. So when things are significantly outside of what would be expected in clinical practice, that should alert us or at least raise a red flag for the possibility that somebody might be faking these symptoms. Another one is when the observed symptoms do not match the reported symptoms, and this is where I say things like objective measures such as actual weight loss due to lack of appetite in depression is very helpful to know because you now have an objective measure to point to and say, yeah, this individual is not eating very much because they've lost 10 pounds in the last 2 weeks or something like that. So these are 4 factors that can start to alert you to the possibility of malingering. Now we can get more specific about the types of symptoms that somebody might be faking. So we're going to start with malingered depression first. Now, I said before that about 25 to 30% of patients who claimed major depression in civil litigation were malingering. So this is a large percentage of people, a quarter of the people that are involved in some type of civil litigation involving major depression are malingering. So we have to be on the lookout for this, and we have to understand that it can come up because there is a major secondary gain potentially in these cases. What do I do to kind of alert myself to these things or pay attention to the circumstances that might tip me off that something's not right here? So, with depression, I pay careful attention to affect during the evaluation. So, what I mean by affect is, when you ask your patient, what is your mood? That's their subjective sense of what their mood is. So, a lot of times in depression, a person's going to say, well, doc, I'm very down, I'm very low, I'm very depressed, right? So, their mood is depressed. Now, I want to see that affect, their facial expressions, their motor movements, all kind of match the depression that they're claiming to have. And sometimes what will happen is somebody will come in and they'll say, doc, I'm just so freaking depressed. I don't know what's going on. They're smiling the whole time. They're reactive to things that are positive during the evaluation, like potential positive outcomes, especially if it involves, again, getting out of a legal situation or potentially obtaining some type of money or whatever from something. These are things that are incongruent with what we know about somebody who's truly depressed. So essentially their mood should match the affect, and you can look for that in clinical practice. The other one I briefly mentioned already, but I'm going to talk more about it here, is that the person's psychomotor movement, right, and their thinking. These are two things that are very, very important, because if we go back to the original definitions of depression, depression wasn't thought of as like depressed mood, it was depression in psychomotor movement and thinking, right? The person was slow of movement, slow of thinking. And we can pay careful attention to that because those are really, in my opinion, hallmarks of true biological depressions too. When somebody is severely psychomotor slowed, or as we call it in the industry, psychomotor retarded, even though that term has fallen out of favor, obviously, for obvious reasons, but psychomotor retardation is still used as a description of somebody in a mental status exam. So we can look for those two factors. So affect should be matching what the mood is, and they should be psychomotor slowed, their thinking should be slowed, their body movement should be slowed, etc. We also can look for objective signs of neurovegetative symptoms. So if somebody, for example, says, I have a very, very low appetite, doc, I'm not eating anything, well then you might want to have a weight on the person from a previous visit to see that there was an actual change in weight. Because, if somebody says they're not eating and then you check their weight and they're 10 pounds heavier than they were, then obviously they're eating. So, or there's some other serious medical problem going on. But the point is, you have an objective measure to point to saying like this person's statements about their symptoms are matching the objective measures that we have. You also want to be aware of symptoms that are the opposite of depression. So sometimes what somebody will do is they'll come in and say, doc, I'm feeling so guilty. Everyone else is terrible. They've done this to me. Look at where they put me. And blaming others is not true guilt, right? There's a difference between the type of guilt experienced in a real depression versus somebody blaming other people. So we know that guilt is very common in depression. So that would be another example of watching out for symptoms that are the opposite of what the person is saying. All right, so before I jump into malingered psychosis, which is the next topic, I want to briefly touch on the Rosenhan experiment. So in 1973, this researcher Rosenhan, along with 7 other people, designed an experiment to gain admission to inpatient psychiatric facilities under the pretense that they were psychotic, they were hearing voices, right? So this experiment shook up psychiatry. It continues to be cited as an indication that clinicians can be easily fooled and that these symptoms and diseases don't really exist, etc., etc. So this study has many problems if you actually read the study, and I would encourage you to do so. It's widely available on the internet just with a quick Google search. And it was rigorously dissected, honestly, in a 2019 book called The Great Pretender, which revealed inconsistencies in the data, as well as fabricated information. So it's possible that the study itself was grossly exaggerated by Rosenhan. However, either way, it remains a topic of great debate. Now, for me, what does this study tell us? Well, it doesn't say much about psychiatric diagnosis, but it says a lot about feigning medical illness or psychiatric illness, and not necessarily here for secondary gain because they were, well, I mean, you might argue it was for secondary gain, right? because they were publishing this big paper that was essentially going to keep their careers going and possibly lead to monetary benefits as well. So maybe there was some secondary gain as well. But anyway, it doesn't say a lot about psychiatric diagnosis. It says a lot, though, about feigning symptoms. Now, psychiatric diagnosis, as we know, relies largely on the patient's reports, and we wouldn't expect patients to purposely be faking symptoms. It's not necessarily an assumption that one has outside of a forensic setting. And all of these evaluations and hospitals that they gained admission to at the time were not forensic units. So a forensic psychiatrist or somebody expecting, possible malingering or possible fictitious disorder, for example, would maybe be more alert to these circumstances. So that takes us to malingered psychosis. Now, when somebody appears to be malingering, we have to look for clinical clues. We have to be detectives. I mean, not that we're not doing that already. I think when you're taking histories, you are trying to uncover the circumstances, but you have to be a little bit more careful. So when a patient presents with symptoms that do not fit any diagnosis, they don't fit any of the known DSM-5 diagnoses, then you would be automatically thinking, okay, something's off here. When someone appears to be overacting the part or trying to oversell their symptoms, this is also sometimes obvious in clinical practice. When somebody makes contradicting statements, when someone is guarded or evasive when you're asking questions, these are clues to dig deeper into the story and possibly even say a lot about the benefits of calling for collateral information when you're unsure of things, calling a friend or family member that knows the individual well to confirm or deny some of the information that's being told to you. Now, in true psychosis, people can often describe the voice or voices that they are hearing. So asking follow-up questions to really quantify what's going on there makes a lot of sense. So you can ask questions like, is it one voice or multiple voices? Is the voice male or female? Is it someone known or not known to you? And is it loud or soft? Is it constant or is it intermittent, right? There's many questions that you can start to ask about the auditory hallucinations this individual is talking about. And the patient with true psychosis should be able to elaborate on those details more so, right? If somebody becomes vague or evasive, that's when you start thinking, okay, maybe this is not what's going on. So looking for inconsistencies and evasiveness in the description of auditory hallucinations. If the person has no ability to describe the auditory hallucinations, or they become again angry or evasive during the evaluation when further questioned, this should raise some red flags for possible malingering. Genuine auditory hallucinations also occur in words and sentences. There are examples of other circumstances where this may not be true. So for example, drug intoxication often involves auditory hallucinations that are inaudible or unformed noises, for example. But in most cases, the content of the voices that somebody hears should be in words or sentences, and they're often derogatory in nature. For example, sometimes calling a female patient a slut or a male, or questioning a male patient's sexuality are common derogatory statements that somebody might be hearing when it comes to auditory hallucinations. Now, majority of patients who experience auditory hallucinations, 76% in this case, have a strategy for reducing those voices. They have some way to cope with the circumstances. So common strategies include things like working, resting, seeking support from friends and loved ones, and taking medication. Things that were not helpful, and this was a little bit interesting to me because you often hear these as examples of things you should do to help you cope with auditory hallucinations. So things that were not helpful were listening to music, watching television, and being alone were all found not to be helpful by the individuals experiencing auditory hallucinations. So we want to suspect malingering when it comes to psychosis when the voices are vague, inaudible, and not associated with a delusion. This is another very important point that I want to make here. Auditory hallucinations are almost always, 86% of the time, associated with some type of delusion. So that's going to be the topic of the next section here. So let's talk malingered versus true delusions. So awareness of the general themes of delusions in psychiatric practice is important. The common ones being paranoid delusions, grandiosity or grandiose delusions, and religious delusions are seen all the time in clinical practice. So when somebody deviates from those common themes, we might be suspecting that malingering is going on. So those delusions that deviate, we should, from the established science and the established literature and research, then we should question them further. Doesn't necessarily mean they're false right up front, but it means that we should do some more investigating. So in malingered delusions, we're looking for things like abrupt onset. So a delusion is defined as a fixed false belief, and often these fixed false beliefs don't occur overnight. They don't just suddenly come on. They're developed over time, and they continue to be reinforced. So that's one thing. We should look for abrupt onset as a possible red flag. An eagerness to call attention to the symptoms and specifically to the delusion. A lot of times when you're interacting with the patient, it's going to take some time to build some rapport to get that person to trust you before they might open up and say, you know what, Doc, you're right. There actually is a chip in my head that's causing me all of these problems. They're not going to usually lead with that information. So that's another potential red flag. So patients might be guarded initially about these delusions. So it takes some questioning to get to that point. If the person has bizarre behavior that's not associated or accompanied by thought disorder, right, or disordered thinking. So let's give an example of that. This is the example of the person who's facing a serious charge in prison, who's been evaluated, who does not have any other psychotic symptoms, but suddenly begins playing with their feces, for example. Again, bizarre behavior that is out of the context of what is known about this individual, and during the evaluation you're not observing thought disorder or disordered speech, but then suddenly they're playing with their feces. This would be another example of something that might be a red flag when it comes to malingering. Alright guys, so I'm going to hold the video there. I think this is a lot of good information. Again, it's a topic that's not always discussed outside of the forensic psychiatric setting, specifically if you're working in prison systems or you're working in forensic evaluations, for example. You know, this is something that you absolutely have to be attuned to because it's very, very common. Again, in general practice, we don't assume that somebody's coming in to fake symptoms for secondary gain or to fake symptoms to assume the role of the patient in the case of fictitious disorders. However, it can happen. We should be aware of it, and we should look for some of these potential red flags and do further follow-up questioning to either confirm, rule in, or rule out the possibility of malingering. With that said, I'm going to hold the video there, guys. I would love to see your comments and questions below, and I will try to get to them as soon as I can. And again, if you are not a member of this community, please consider becoming a member. It really does help me to keep this thing going. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.